Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to understand one very important concept in economics, that is ICOR. That stands for Incremental Capital to Output Ratio. Okay, so many times we heard this thing in the newspaper कि India's GDP growth rate is going to be 6.5, or according to World Bank it is going to be 6.2 as per RBI. So they give the prediction about country's GDP growth rate, and they also mention कि we have to accelerate our GDP growth rate. And in order to accelerate GDP growth rate, most of the times you will heard about कि we have to focus on our infrastructure, we have to invest more money on what? We have to invest more money on capital expenditure. Here, one important factor need to be mentioned is what? Investments. Fine? Investments. Because if more investments will be there, it will lead to what? It will lead to more and more increase in the growth rate of GDP. So, how a GDP growth rate is related to the factor of investment, or in order to achieve, suppose a country is having 6.5% GDP growth rate and country want to achieve 7 or 8% GDP growth rate. So in order to achieve this 7.5 or 8% GDP growth rate, what should be the percentage of investment of the total income should be there? In order to find out, we use the concept of what? Incremental capital to output ratio. Incremental capital to output ratio. In order to calculate this, we uses the formula of delta y upon delta x. What is delta y here? Change in investments. Change in investments, and here change in GDP. So how your GDP is changing and how much investment is changing. Okay, so the change and change in the GDP, corresponding change in the GDP, we are able to calculate what? Incremental capital to output ratio. Okay, now take an example. Suppose that country's investment is total 50 crore rupees. When the investment of 50 crore rupees is made, the GDP of 200 crore is being generated. Fine? GDP growth rate of what? This is investment, and with this investment we are able to get GDP worth how much? 200 crore. Now investments are increased to 55 crores. Investments are increased to how much? 55 crore. Means 5 crore additional investments we are able to make. Okay. Then we are able to see GDP growth rate of 250 crores. 250 crore, that is a GDP growth rate. So what is change in the GDP growth rate? Change in the GDP growth rate is 50 crore. Change in the GDP growth rate is how much? Change in the GDP growth rate is 50 crore. Whereas change in input, investment, change in the investment is how much? 5 crore. 5 crore. So what will be the value of ICOR? The value of ICOR will be how much? 0.1. 0.1. Now, suppose we have made the investment of how much? From 50 to 55 crore. Whereas the GDP growth rate is how much? GDP growth rate is 220 crore only. When you have 50 crore, then GDP is how much? 200 crore. But when you went for how much? 55 crore, GDP growth rate is how much? 220 crore. Now this time, if you'll calculate, what? If you'll calculate ICOR, then what will happen? Change in investment is how much? Change in investment is 5 crore. But change in the GDP is how much? 20 crore. Change in the GDP is how much? 20 crore. Okay. Now, what will be the value of IOCR? What will be the value of IOCR? So, what will be the value? This time value will be 0.25. Have you seen that? When we have GDP growth rate of 250 crore from 200, investment increased by what? 5 crore. GDP value increased by how much? 250 crore. What the IOCR value? IOCR value is 0.1. But when we have corresponding lower GDP growth rate in comparison to the same investment of 5 crore, but now GDP grown by how much? Only 220 crore. Means 20 crore addition in what? GDP. Earlier GDP addition was how much? 50 crore. So, what happens if less value in GDP, the value of IOCR is what? Increased. So, if investments are not effective, then we have higher value of what? ICOR. We are going to have higher value of ICOR. In other words, we can say that a country is having higher ICOR. A country which is having what? Higher ICOR, that country have less efficient investment. So a country which have what? Suppose that ICOR of country A. ICOR value of country A is coming to 2. Whereas ICOR value of country B is coming to how much? 4. It shows that highly efficient capital in comparison to country B. So country A have higher efficient capital investment in comparison to what? In comparison to country B. Okay. Understood? One more thing understand here. This country means 50 crore was initial investment. When investment increased to how much? 55 crore. So when 50 crore investment was there, we got how much? We got 200 crore GDP. When we go for 55 crore investment, we got the GDP of how much? We got the GDP of 220 crore. Now, 220 crore, our ICOR value reached to how much? 0.25. Now, if we want to achieve GDP growth of how much? GDP of 250 crore, we must have ICOR value how much? 0.1. 0.1. So, these things help in the policy makers. ICOR helps the policy maker to what extent we have to change our what? To what extent we have to change our ICOR in order to achieve desired growth rate. As in the beginning, what I have mentioned. In the beginning, I have mentioned that we have GDP growth rate of how much? We have GDP growth rate of 6.5%. And we are targeting what? We are targeting 8% GDP growth rate. So to achieve 8% GDP growth rate, how much ICOR is required? What should be the value of ICOR is required? You have calculated that value. How you have calculated the value? Change in the investment in the numerator and change in the GDP in the denominator. So you have calculated what? ICOR. How we have calculated? We have calculated this ICOR is equal to what? Change in investment upon change in GDP. Change in what? GDP. Can we write this? How much change in investment is required? If we want to calculate how much change in investment is required, what we have to do? We have to multiply ICOR value multiplied by change in GDP. So if we have ICOR value, if we have change in the GDP value, then we calculate how much investment is required. How much investment is required. For example, during 12th 5-year plan, FYP, 5-year plan, which was having the duration of 2012 to 2017. In that phase, according to Planning Commission of that time. So when Planning Commission have this 12th 5-year plan need to be executed between 2000 and 2012 to 2017, Planning Commission have mentioned that we need 38% of investment. Means, in the very simple term, if a person is earning how much? 100 rupees, 38 rupees would be under what? Saving and investment. Saving investment. So if we want to achieve, according to Planning Commission, for 12th 5-year plan, which was from 2012 to 2017, if we want to achieve 8% GDP growth rate during this phase, we need how much? 38% of investment. So if we are able to achieve investment rate of how much? 38%. If we are able to achieve investment rate of 38%, then we can achieve what? GDP growth rate of how much? 8%. Fine? 8%. And actually, India was able to achieve investment rate of 32%. 32%. And that is why the growth rate during that 12th 5-year plan was much below than 8%, and it is average around 6.8 to 7%. Fine. So this is an illustration ki how ICOR is an important factor. How this ICOR, incremental capital to output ratio, is an important factor. Okay, now just conclude this by focusing on few concepts. If a country is having higher ICOR, it shows less efficient capital investment. Your investments are what? Your investments are less efficient. Okay, one thing. Another thing, if ICOR is multiplied by change in GDP, we can find out how much change in investments are required to achieve desirable GDP growth rate. So if we have ICOR value and we know what present change in what? Present change in GDP, then we can calculate what? Investments, what required. Okay, in other words, we can say that with this ICOR, we can calculate how much change in the investment is required. How much change in the investment is required to achieve the desirable GDP growth rate. Okay, now those who are watching this video, I have a question for you. The question for you is, find out what is our India's ICOR value. Do the Google search. Do the Google search, find out what is India's ICOR value, find and change in the GDP, then find out what is the investment rate in India. Okay, try to do this activity. Okay, so if you will do some calculations by using certain data, it will help you. Now, this concept is already asked in the UPSC prelims exam. They have already asked this. But these concepts are not just helpful for the prelims exam. In fact, while writing the mains examination, fine. When you are writing how to increase our GDP growth rate, fine. So most of the time students are writing to increase the GDP growth rate what? Government have to increase the capital expenditure. Government have to increase the capital expenditure. More private participation is required. Infrastructure should be good. Credit availability should be good. These things you are mentioning. But suppose that India's ICOR is what? 5%. Suppose. And you have mentioned in your answer that India's ICOR value is 5%, whereas other countries like tiger economies, ASEAN economies, basically like Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, these economies are called as tiger economies because they have achieved phenomenal growth. Phenomenal growth they have achieved from 1990 to 2000, early 2000. So that is why they was called as what? Tiger economies. Fine. So if you compare the GDP growth rate of tiger economies, it is much higher than what? It is much lower than what? India's incremental capital to output ratio. So you can mention this point. In order to achieve high GDP growth rate, India must have to increase the rate of investment, and India should focus also on decreasing the ICOR values. In nutshell, what concepts you read for the prelims point of view, you can use those concepts while writing what? Mains answer. Okay? I hope you have understood this ICOR, and if you want to learn more concepts like this, please comment and mention what topic you want to understand. I'll make video on that. Okay? Thank you.